The architectural history of Salzburg. Salzburg is often described as a city frozen in time, yet its architecture tells a story of constant change shaped by politics, religion, art, and geography. Nestled between the Alps and divided by the Salzach River, Salzburg developed not as a commercial metropolis, but as a powerful ecclesiastical city. Over centuries, layers of Roman planning, medieval fortifications, Baroque splendor, and modern preservation efforts have created one of Europe's most harmonious historic urban landscapes. Understanding Salzburg's architectural history means tracing this evolution step by step, from its earliest foundations to its careful conservation today. Introduction: Salzburg as a living architectural museum. Unlike cities that expanded rapidly through industrialization, Salzburg grew under the steady influence of its prince-archbishops, who ruled both spiritually and politically. This unique power structure allowed architecture to become a tool of authority and artistic expression rather than mere utility. As a result, Salzburg's cityscape developed with remarkable consistency. Churches, palaces, and public squares were designed to impress, inspire devotion, and reflect stability. Today, walking through Salzburg feels like moving through an open-air museum, where every building contributes to a carefully preserved historical narrative. Early foundations, Roman roots, and medieval beginnings. The architectural story of Salzburg begins in Roman times, when the settlement of Iuvavum was established as part of the Roman province of Naricum. The Romans introduced organized street layouts, stone construction, and early infrastructure such as baths and administrative buildings. Although little Roman architecture remains visible today, archaeological evidence reveals that Salzburg's urban foundations were laid during this period. These early planning principles influenced later development, especially in the Old Town. After the decline of Roman rule, Salzburg entered the early medieval era, marked by the rise of Christianity. The city became an important religious center in the 7th century under Saint Rupert, who founded St. Peter's Abbey. This monastery, one of the oldest in the German-speaking world, set the tone for Salzburg's architectural future. Early medieval buildings were modest, built with thick stone walls, small windows, and simple forms designed for protection and permanence rather than beauty. By the Middle Ages, Salzburg had grown into a fortified town. Defensive architecture became essential, culminating in the construction of Fortress Hohensalzburg in 1077. Perched high above the city, the fortress dominated the skyline and served as both a military stronghold and a symbol of archiepiscopal power. Narrow streets, enclosed courtyards, and compact residential buildings reflected the medieval need for security within the city walls. The prince-archbishops and the Baroque transformation. Salzburg's most defining architectural phase began in the late 16th and 17th centuries, when the prince-archbishops embraced Baroque architecture as a statement of power, faith, and cultural sophistication. Inspired by Rome and northern Italy, they commissioned grand building projects that reshaped the city into a Baroque masterpiece. The Salzburg Cathedral stands at the heart of this transformation. Rebuilt in the early 17th century, it replaced earlier medieval structures with a monumental Baroque design featuring twin towers, a grand dome, and a richly decorated interior. The cathedral's scale and symmetry were meant to rival the great churches of Italy, signaling Salzburg's importance within the Catholic world. Surrounding the cathedral, the Residence and Domkartier complex formed a ceremonial center for religious and political life. These palaces, with their elegant facades, grand halls, and interconnected courtyards, reflected absolute authority combined with artistic refinement. Urban planning during this period was highly intentional. Squares such as Domplatz and Residenzplatz were carefully designed to frame monumental buildings and create theatrical public spaces. Another key feature of Salzburg's Baroque architecture was its harmony with the surrounding landscape. Rather than overwhelming the city, Baroque buildings were integrated into the existing medieval fabric. Decorative facades masked older structures, while sightlines were planned to emphasize landmarks like the fortress and cathedral. This balance between old and new gave Salzburg a sense of continuity rather than rupture. From the 19th century to modern conservation, the 19th century brought significant political and social changes to Salzburg. The dissolution of the prince-archbishopric in the early 1800s ended ecclesiastical rule, and the city gradually shifted toward a more civic identity. Architectural styles of this period reflected broader European trends, including historicism and neoclassical influences. New residential districts developed outside the medieval core, allowing the historic center to remain largely intact. The arrival of the railway also influenced urban expansion. While industrial architecture was never dominant in Salzburg, transportation infrastructure and public buildings introduced more practical design approaches. Importantly, city planners began to recognize the cultural value of Salzburg's historic architecture and resisted large-scale modernization that might disrupt its character. In the 20th century, preservation became a central concern. Following the devastation of World War II in other European cities, Salzburg emerged relatively unscathed. This survival reinforced the importance of protecting its architectural heritage. Strict building regulations were introduced to control height, materials, and design within the historic center. In 1996, Salzburg's Old Town was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This recognition acknowledged not only individual buildings, but the overall unity of the city's architectural evolution. Conservation efforts today focus on maintaining authenticity while allowing the city to function as a living urban environment. Modern architecture exists in Salzburg, but it is carefully designed to respect historical context. Conclusion: harmony between history and modern life. Salzburg's architectural history is a story of continuity shaped by careful leadership, religious influence, and respect for tradition. From Roman planning and medieval fortifications to Baroque grandeur and modern preservation, each era added a layer without erasing the past. This balance is what makes Salzburg exceptional. Rather than standing as a relic of history, the city remains alive, where centuries-old buildings continue to serve daily life. Salzburg's architecture proves that progress and preservation can coexist, creating a timeless urban landscape admired around the world. Salzburg's architecture cannot be understood simply as a sequence of styles or periods. It is above all a visual expression of power, faith, and control. For centuries, the city was ruled by prince-archbishops who held both spiritual authority and political power. Architecture became their most effective language, one that communicated dominance, religious devotion, and cultural ambition without the need for words. From towering fortresses to lavish Baroque churches, Salzburg's built environment tells a story of authority carefully crafted in stone. Introduction: architecture as a symbol of power in Salzburg. Unlike many European cities shaped by merchants or royal courts, Salzburg developed under ecclesiastical rule. This unique system meant that nearly every major architectural project served a dual purpose: glorifying God and reinforcing the ruler's authority. The city's dramatic natural setting, surrounded by mountains and divided by the Salzach River, amplified this effect. Buildings were positioned to command views, dominate public spaces, and remind residents and visitors alike of who held power. Salzburg was designed not only to be lived in, but to be seen and obeyed. Sacred architecture and the rise of church dominance. Christianity shaped Salzburg's identity from an early stage. In the 7th century, Saint Rupert established Salzburg as a center of missionary activity, laying the foundation for centuries of church-led development. Monasteries, abbeys, and churches became the city's most important structures, both spiritually and architecturally. St. Peter's Abbey played a crucial role in this early period. Its solid stone construction, enclosed courtyards, and Romanesque features reflected the church's desire for permanence and order. These early religious buildings were not overly decorative. Instead, they conveyed stability and moral authority. Their thick walls and simple forms also served practical purposes in uncertain medieval times. As the church's influence grew, so did the scale of its architecture. Cathedrals and pilgrimage churches were designed to inspire awe. Height, symmetry, and controlled interior light were used to direct attention upward, reinforcing the idea of divine power. Religious buildings became the city's visual anchors, shaping not only the skyline but also daily life. Markets, processions, and public gatherings all revolved around these sacred spaces, ensuring that faith remained central to urban experience. Baroque grandeur and absolute rule. The most dramatic transformation of Salzburg occurred during the Baroque era, when the prince-archbishops consciously used architecture as a political tool. Influenced by the Catholic Counter-Reformation, they turned to Baroque design to project strength, confidence, and religious triumph. Italian architects were invited to Salzburg, bringing with them ideas rooted in Rome's grand urban tradition. The Salzburg Cathedral stands as the clearest example of this strategy. Its monumental facade, twin towers, and expansive interior were designed to overwhelm the senses. The cathedral was not merely a place of worship, it was a stage for power. Ceremonies held inside reinforced the prince-archbishop's role as both religious leader and ruler, while the building's sheer scale dwarfed the individual. Surrounding the cathedral, the Residence and Dom Quartier complex further emphasized absolute authority. These palatial structures housed administrative offices, ceremonial halls, and private apartments. Their carefully planned layouts allowed the ruler to move between sacred and secular spaces without ever stepping outside, symbolizing the unity of church and state. Urban planning during the Baroque period was equally deliberate. Public squares such as Residenzplatz were designed as open theaters, framed by monumental facades. These spaces allowed power to be displayed through processions, celebrations, and public appearances. Architecture controlled how people moved, gathered, and observed authority, making the city itself an instrument of rule. Fortress Hohensalzburg, control from above. No building in Salzburg expresses dominance more clearly than Fortress Hohensalzburg. Rising high above the old town, it is one of the largest and best-preserved medieval fortresses in Europe. Built initially for defense, the fortress also served as a constant visual reminder of the Prince-Archbishop's power. Its elevated position was strategic and symbolic. From the fortress, rulers could oversee the entire city, while citizens below were always aware of its presence. Over time, the fortress evolved from a purely military structure into a fortified residence, complete with decorated rooms and chapels. This transformation reflected a shift in power, from physical defense to psychological control. Even as the city below adopted Baroque elegance, the fortress retained its austere character. This contrast reinforced the hierarchy between ruler and subject. Beauty existed in the city, but ultimate authority remained firmly above it. Architecture after the prince-archbishops. The end of ecclesiastical rule in the early 19th century marked a turning point in Salzburg's architectural history. Without the prince-archbishops, architecture lost its role as a direct expression of absolute power. Civic buildings, residential houses, and cultural institutions became more prominent. However, the legacy of authority remained embedded in the city's fabric. New architectural developments were carefully controlled to avoid disrupting the historic balance. Rather than replacing Baroque structures, later generations chose to adapt and preserve them. This respect for the past reflected a shift from power through dominance to power through heritage. Conclusion: architecture that still commands respect. Salzburg's architecture continues to command attention, not through force but through presence. The city's buildings remind us how architecture can shape behavior, belief, and identity. For centuries, power and faith were inseparable in Salzburg, and stone became their shared language. Today, even in a modern democratic society, these structures retain their authority, not as rulers, but as witnesses to a time when architecture ruled the city as much as any prince or archbishop. Salzburg is a city best understood on foot. Unlike vast European capitals, its historic center is compact, intimate, and deeply layered with history. As you walk through Salzburg, architecture unfolds gradually, revealing centuries of change within a remarkably small space. Medieval lanes open into Baroque squares, fortresses rise above elegant churches, and modest townhouses sit beside grand palaces. This physical closeness of styles and periods makes Salzburg feel less like a museum and more like a living timeline, where every step carries you through another chapter of architectural history. Introduction: a city best understood on foot. Salzburg's walkability is not accidental. It is the result of centuries of organic growth shaped by geography and power. Hemmed in by mountains and the Salzach River, the city had little room to expand outward, forcing it to evolve inward. This constraint preserved the historic core and encouraged a dense urban fabric. Today, walking through Salzburg offers an immersive experience where architecture is not isolated in monuments, but woven into everyday life. Streets, bridges, and squares act as connectors between eras, allowing the past to remain visible and accessible. Medieval streets and defensive architecture. The medieval heart of Salzburg is defined by narrow streets, enclosed courtyards, and buildings that appear almost pressed together. These features reflect a time when safety and efficiency were more important than openness. Buildings were constructed close to one another to conserve space and strengthen defensive walls. Many houses were tall and narrow, with thick stone walls and small windows, designed to protect inhabitants while accommodating growing populations. Above it all stands Fortress Hohensalzburg, the city's most dominant architectural presence. Visible from nearly every point in the Old Town, the fortress anchors Salzburg's medieval identity. Built in the late 11th century, it was designed as a defensive stronghold and a symbol of authority. As you walk through the city below, the fortress constantly enters and exits your field of vision, creating a sense of oversight that medieval residents would have felt daily. Within the Old Town, streets like Getreidegasse reveal another layer of medieval urban life. Famous for its wrought iron shop signs and long, narrow passages, this street demonstrates how architecture adapted to commerce within tight spatial limits. Buildings often extend deep into the block, with internal courtyards providing light and air. These architectural solutions allowed medieval Salzburg to function as a thriving town without expanding beyond its walls. Baroque squares and elegant public spaces. As you move from Salzburg's narrow medieval lanes into its open squares, the city's Baroque transformation becomes immediately apparent. The transition is dramatic and intentional. Baroque architecture was designed to surprise, impress, and guide movement, and Salzburg's Prince Archbishops used urban design to shape the experience of the city. Domplatz and Residenzplatz are the clearest examples of this approach. These squares open suddenly, creating a sense of theatrical revelation. The Salzburg Cathedral dominates Domplatz with its grand facade and twin towers, while the surrounding buildings frame the space with symmetry and restraint. Every element, from building height to facade color, was carefully planned to maintain visual harmony. Baroque Salzburg also emphasized the relationship between architecture and landscape. Views were choreographed so that churches, palaces, and the fortress aligned with natural features. This created a feeling that the city and its surroundings belonged to the same composition. Walking through these spaces, one senses a deliberate rhythm. Tight passages leading to expansive squares, shadow giving way to light. Mirabel Palace and its gardens further illustrate this Baroque philosophy. Located across the river from the Old Town, Mirabel offers a more relaxed, elegant experience. The gardens act as an outdoor extension of architecture, with pathways, statues, and fountains guiding movement and framing views toward the fortress and cathedral. Here, walking becomes part of the architectural narrative, turning the visitor into an active participant in the city's design. 19th to 20th century additions and urban expansion. Crossing the Salzach River introduces yet another layer of Salzburg's architectural story. The 19th century brought political change and modernization, but unlike many European cities, Salzburg avoided drastic transformation. Instead, growth occurred gradually and with respect for the historic core. New residential neighborhoods developed outside the medieval center, featuring wider streets, larger windows, and more decorative facades influenced by historicism and early modern styles. These areas feel more open and residential, reflecting changes in lifestyle and social structure. Walking here, the pace of the city shifts. Architecture becomes less monumental and more personal, designed for comfort rather than authority. The 20th century introduced modern buildings, transportation infrastructure, and cultural institutions. Yet even these additions were carefully integrated. Height restrictions, material guidelines, and preservation laws ensured that modern architecture did not overpower historic landmarks. As a result, Salzburg avoided the visual fragmentation seen in many modern cities. Conclusion: a city where every street tells a story. Walking through Salzburg is like reading a book written in stone. Each street, square, and building contributes a sentence to a larger narrative that spans centuries. Medieval defensiveness, Baroque grandeur, and modern restraint coexist in close proximity, creating a city that feels both timeless and alive. Salzburg's architectural history is not confined to museums or monuments. It unfolds with every step. By walking through the city, one does not simply observe history, one inhabits it. Salzburg's architecture is often admired for its beauty, symmetry, and historical depth, but its true significance lies in what it represents. More than a collection of historic buildings, Salzburg's architecture is a reflection of cultural identity shaped by nature, faith, power, and artistic ambition. Over centuries, the city developed a visual language that expresses harmony rather than excess, continuity rather than disruption. To understand Salzburg's architectural history is to understand how its people learned to build not just for function or display, but as an extension of their cultural values. Introduction: more than buildings, a cultural expression. Unlike cities driven by trade or industry, Salzburg evolved as a cultural and religious center. Architecture here was never purely utilitarian. It was symbolic. Buildings were designed to communicate order, devotion, and refinement. This mindset produced a city where even modest structures contribute to a shared aesthetic. The consistency of scale, color, and material across Salzburg is no accident. It reflects a collective commitment to visual unity. Architecture became a way of preserving identity, linking past and present through a common language of form. Nature and architecture, building with the landscape. One of Salzburg's most defining characteristics is its relationship with the natural environment. Surrounded by the Alps and divided by the Salzach River, the city developed in close dialogue with its landscape. Rather than flattening hills or overpowering nature, Salzburg's builders adapted to it. This respect for the terrain shaped both the placement and appearance of buildings. Fortress Hohensalzburg is the most striking example of this relationship. Built atop a rocky hill, it appears almost as an extension of the mountain itself. Its mass follows the contours of the terrain, reinforcing the impression that it belongs to the landscape rather than sitting upon it. This integration of architecture and nature sends a powerful message. Authority here is rooted in the land. Churches and monasteries also reflect this philosophy. Many were constructed using local stone, giving buildings a color palette that mirrors the surrounding mountains. Rooflines were kept relatively low and consistent, allowing natural features to remain visually dominant. Even Baroque buildings, known elsewhere for dramatic contrast, were adapted in Salzburg to maintain balance with the environment. The Salzach River played a similar role in shaping identity. Bridges, embankments, and riverside buildings were designed to frame views rather than block them. The river became a visual corridor connecting architectural landmarks, reinforcing the idea that Salzburg is a city composed as a whole rather than as isolated parts. Baroque artistry and urban harmony. Salzburg's Baroque period is often seen as its most glorious architectural phase, yet its significance lies not in extravagance but in harmony. Under the rule of the prince-archbishops, architecture was used to express cultural confidence and religious devotion, but always within a controlled framework. Baroque facades in Salzburg are elegant rather than overwhelming. Decorative elements are carefully balanced, with an emphasis on proportion and rhythm. Public squares such as Domplatz and Residenzplatz demonstrate how architecture, space, and movement were choreographed to create a unified experience. Buildings do not compete for attention. Instead, they support one another visually. This harmony extended to urban life. Squares were designed not only for ceremonies, but also for social interaction. Architecture provided a setting for daily activities, reinforcing a shared sense of place. The city became a stage where culture, faith, and community intersected. Interior spaces further reveal Salzburg's cultural priorities. Churches feature rich ornamentation, music galleries, and carefully controlled acoustics, reflecting the city's deep connection to music and performance. Architecture here was not static. It was meant to be experienced through sound, movement, and ritual. Preservation, tourism, and modern challenges. In the modern era, Salzburg's architectural identity faces new challenges. Tourism brings economic benefits, but also pressure on historic spaces. The city's response to this challenge reveals how deeply architecture is tied to cultural self-understanding. Strict preservation laws protect the old town, regulating building heights, materials, and alterations. These rules ensure that new developments do not disrupt the historic skyline or visual coherence. At the same time, Salzburg recognizes that it is a living city. Historic buildings are adapted for modern use, serving as homes, shops, museums, and cultural venues. Modern architecture exists in Salzburg, but it is intentionally restrained. Contemporary buildings often echo traditional proportions and materials, demonstrating continuity rather than contrast. This approach reflects a cultural belief that progress should respect heritage rather than replace it. The designation of Salzburg's Old Town as a UNESCO World Heritage Site formalized this philosophy. The recognition acknowledges not just individual landmarks, but the cultural landscape created by centuries of careful building. Preservation is seen not as nostalgia, but as responsibility. Conclusion: Salzburg's timeless architectural identity. Salzburg's architecture tells a story of cultural self-awareness. Every era added to the city without erasing what came before, creating a layered yet coherent identity. Nature, faith, and artistry shaped buildings that continue to define how the city sees itself and how it is seen by the world. Salzburg stands as proof that architecture can preserve identity across centuries, not by resisting change, but by guiding it with respect and intention.